a different presentation. At this point, I need to apologize for a technical glitch. There was a section of the previous recording which did not go through, and so I'm trying to put in the context that prepares you for what will follow in the rest of the lecture. I was just starting to talk about the difference between ideas and ideals, and I pointed out that ideas are attempts to transcend the present moment with notions of variation, notions of improvement of the given situation. And I explained what an ideal was. That is an image of perfection, of a closed, final state of being in life, in nature, in society, that is impossible to impose on the reality of an ongoing human reality. The only way it can be imposed, and we will see this in the course of all the 5 lectures, the only way to impose it is in fact to deny the reality of human beings in their finiteness and in their imperfection, in the openness of history itself. An ideal assumes that history can come to a stop, that something is imagined as perfect, which will then be absolutized, imposed as a better situation. What I need to say also is that the whole phenomenon of having ideas and imagining ideals comes out of the human reality. It's only the human being who is what I call a transcendent being, in the sense that he not only functions according to the moment and the stimuli that he has, but he also reflects. We think of the past, we think of the future, we think of alternatives. We don't assume that whatever is beyond question, is final, is automatic, but rather as transcendent human beings, we question whether something cannot be improved on. I had just said that Utopia, Thomas More's book, was written at a time at which an imagined alternative to the current society was written about, because the current society, the current social tension was unacceptable. And a better picture of what would be better for human beings is the content of Thomas More's book of Utopia and many other utopian writings and utopian reflections. It's this tension between what is and what I can imagine as an alternative that describes us as human beings, and only human beings are so capable of imagining an alternative. It is not only so, however, in relationship to us as human beings, that's also the context that Christianity undergirds and justifies and encourages. We find that sanctioned in Scripture, where God created a world in the course of 6 periods of time, however long they were. He did not make everything at once. He did not make everything to be final. He made, in fact, a world that would develop, grow, run through alternatives, diversify in the course of real time, just as the days of creation are described as the tohu wabohu, or the first day of creation, what Scripture translates as chaos, which actually means something that doesn't have any further designation or description, but it's something there, as that becomes more and more diversified, according to the ideas that God had, when he made the tohu wabohu into a more distinct phenomenon of land and water, of day and night, of animate and inanimate creation, and then finally as human beings and everything else, personal existence as opposed to the impersonal natural reality that follows its course. So you don't have a creation that is to stay the way it was made to begin with, but rather a creation that develops, that changes, that over time becomes more diverse, more specific, more distinct. And it's in that continuity of God's creation that you also find God speaking to the human being that he has made, to Adam and Eve, and gives them mandates to change, to add to what God had made. As I will say again and again in these lectures, God did not create a world to stand still. He did not create a world which at one point was perfect, where every change would be a mark of imperfection. It's rather in its perfection, God included the reality that it will be changed. That's very different from a Greek notion of perfection, where it is believed that if in fact something could be added to what is there, then what was there before was less than perfect. And that's a totally different view from what Scripture gives us. Judaism and Christianity see the perfection in God's character, not in creation, not in a moment of history, because it's not static. And so we find that God addresses human beings with mandates to subdue the earth, to have dominion, to love each other, to have babies, to name the animals, an activity in all its aspects which adds to, makes more specific what God had made in a perspective of change through the flow of time by human creativity and action. And thus, you're encouraged to have ideas about what else can be done with the things that you find, with water and land, with animals and vegetables, with human words and human hands, with the human mind. And the whole focus in Scripture is precisely this continuous change, diversification, alternatives, variation to what God has made in fulfillment of the mandates to be creative. And thus, there is a future to a future that is different from the past, that every day is free to be somewhat different from the day that was there before. And in order to flesh that out, or in order to give it orientation, the Bible very much encourages precisely human beings made in the image of God to have ideas of what else could be done. Just as Scripture says that human beings made in the image of God are made in the image of a God who had ideas. He thought about what kind of a world to make, and that is the kind of world he made. He reflected all kinds of possibilities and decided to make these and to leave others outside. Among other things, I point out that precisely he did perhaps think of making a unicorn and decided against it. I have unicorns here on this tie as a thought of what an animal could look like that we don't find in the real world. It's an imagined reality, an imagined animal. My point is that according to the Bible, God created a world that included its solidity, its originality, and its perfection as a world that is subject to change. Change that God introduced and change that human beings introduce. And ideas now are precisely the way by which we imagine the direction we may want to go, what we may want to do in addition to what is already there. The dynamic of history is part of that way of thinking that the Bible encourages. And thus we look at what is and we imagine what could be. That's of course encouraged even more and takes on an extra dimension when the Bible talks about the fall, when it talks about that tremendous break between what God had made good and beautiful in itself, as Scripture says, God looked at it and said, this is very good, and what took place at the fall. And thus there are not only the mandates to vary the creation aspects that God had made and to invent ways to express one's significance and do further good, but there's also now a broken world in which an additional mandate is given, and that is God says, put your hands to the plow, because you now live in a world in which you not only find variety, but you also find evil, you find death, you find obstruction. And your additional mandate is now to work against evil and against death and against obstruction. In the recognition of this, which is the foundation for the whole emphasis in Christianity to precisely not just repeat what was always there, or to obediently acknowledge what is and never dare to change it. In contrast to that, the Bible encourages precisely this implementation of good ideas. But it also warns us against ideals, which in their nature are a project to arrest the changing realities of history, to absolutize an image of harmony, and to impose it on history so that there would be no more change, no loose ends, nothing untidy or not yet quite finished. Ideology basically is the description, as a content, a perfect situation imagined, in which everything is known, in which everything is regulated, in which everything is reduced to an image of unchanging perfection. And because of history being something else, because reality is changing, because the reality of human beings with their different ideas, their different tastes, their different imaginings and so forth, that kind of ideology, that kind of perfect image cannot be imposed on the reality of history and human beings unless you do tremendous damage to history and to human beings. And we shall see in the second and third session, but then all the way through, and that every time an ideology is embraced as a proposed solution to the openness and the unpredictability of human beings and the rich imagination of human beings, every time ideology kills, ideology squashes something profoundly human, and that is creativity and ideas. We'll see it in the political ideologies, we'll see it in the religious ideologies, but we will also see it down to earth in our own outlook on life itself. For if you want nothing but perfection, if you're prepared to have nothing but perfection or nothing, then you will always have nothing. It's actually if you want perfection or nothing, you will always have nothing. As Francis Schaeffer used to say repeatedly, that's the reality, and that's the reality in history, as we shall see. But now let's get on with what is already recorded, and we'll pick it up at the next recording.